Thanks so much. I'm delighted to be back in Cambridge, at least virtually. I'm zooming in from Amherst. I hope once the pandemic will be over, there will be a chance to see everybody in person again. Let's not give up that hope. The paper that I'm presenting today is titled The Neutrality of Money and the Theory of International Trade, Henry Thornton versus David Ricardo. In recent years, there has been an extensive discussion in the CJE and elsewhere on the nature of money, and theories of money have been conceptualized, distinguished, studied from an ontological perspective. However, most of the policy implications that have been discussed, or the empirical implications of both policy and empirical implications of these theoretical endeavors, were mainly focused on the domestic economy. In this paper, I'm trying to conceptually analyze how different theories of money, different ways of thinking about the nature of money, coincide with different ways of theorizing international trade. I'm taking Tony Lawson's definition of money of his 2016 paper as my starting point. I realize there has been a lot of discussion since the 2016 paper. Nevertheless, I think that this is kind of a bottom line that is useful for what I'm trying to do here. In that paper, Tony is defining money as money is constituted where it is accepted throughout a specific community that a thing or stuff of value is positioned as a generalized form of value to function as a general means of payment in conditions of an equally accepted and appropriately positioned common or shared system of value measurement. Now, I'm using this definition not in order to relaunch the discussion of what money really is, but instead I'm using it as a way to distinguish theories that are monetary or theories that are non-monetary in the realm of theories of international trade. So I'm using this ontological definition of the nature of money as a criterion to analyze whether a theory of international trade is considering money in that sense. Now, I think that this definition is useful for such an exercise because, as has been shown in a number of contributions, this way of thinking about the nature of money can both accommodate credit theories of money and commodity theories of money. So as such, it's not a definition of money that would, by definition, exclude theories that start from a commodity theory as non-monetary, or conversely, theories that start from a credit theory of money as non-monetary. Now, I'm using Thornton and Ricardo as the two theories through which I'm trying to develop my understanding of the relationship between theories of money, theories of international trade, since Henry Thornton and David Ricardo are thought of as two of the towering figures, if not points of origin, of the two broad strands of competing monetary theories. So in that sense, I think it's useful to take two authors that both spoke to each other, but at the same time represent competing strands of the literature in terms of rules versus discretion, and so on. In addition to the question of whether a theory of international trade is monetary or not, I'm asking whether a theory of international trade is based on the assumption of monetary neutrality or not. Monetary neutrality, in its classical definition by Schumpeter, means that so long as money is functioning normally, it does not affect the economic process, which behaves in the same way as it would in a barter economy. Now, in addition to this basic monetary neutrality, this basic definition of monetary neutrality, I'm splitting this up into ex ante neutrality of money and ex post neutrality, taking inspiration of course, the distinction that was started by Myrdal in his monetary equilibrium. So I'm defining ex ante neutrality of money as a situation, a theory in which the interim between the exchange of one good against another does not matter analytically. So this is to say whether an obligation which is created in the process of this exchange is created and immediately discharged on the spot, or is being discharged after a certain while, after an interim, and whatever happens in this interim does not matter analytically. Secondly, I'm defining ex post neutrality as whether or not temporary disturbances are considered so basically whether or not one considers ex ante non-neutrality, the system, the economic system, ultimately behaves as if all exchange was barter. So the interim may or may not be considered analytically, but in the long run, after the fact, it doesn't matter what happened in that interim. Okay, so I'm using this framework of ex ante and ex post neutrality in monetary and non-monetary theories of international trade to analyze the relationship between the theorization of money and the theorization of international trade in Henry Thornton and David Ricardo. For Henry Thornton, I'm using, of course, his most famous and most important book, which is An Inquiry into the Nature and Effects of the Paper Credit of Great Britain of 1802. I'll spare you any intellectual or historical background on Henry Thornton for the purpose of this short presentation. I'd just like to revoke a quote from Hicks, which I think is helpful in trying to understand Thornton, which is, Thornton emerges as a very consistent thinker, but his consistency depends upon his belief that it is possible to draw a firm line between what is appropriate in short-run temporary emergencies and what is appropriate for long-run permanent policy. For the short run, he is Keynesian, far more consistently Keynesian than a muddled Malthus. Yet Keynes never could have taken Thornton for a mascot, as he did Malthus. For when it comes to the long run, Thornton is the hardest of hard money men. He's every bit as hard as Ricardo. Like Ricardo, he would have fought against devaluation when the emergency was finally over. So we can already see that there's this very strict division between the short and the long run in Thornton, which Hicks is calling here a firm line, and which I think can be mapped onto the idea of ex ante and ex post neutrality, where basically ex ante, Thornton is thinking of money as absolutely non-neutral. He's Keynesian in the best sense of the word. However, for the long run and ex post, he is relying on the assumption of monetary neutrality and is building his framework on that assumption. So if we ask ourselves how this hangs together with international trade, I'm really focusing here on the question of whether international trade is being considered as self-balancing or as naturally unbalanced. Why is that relevant? Well, whether we assume trade to be self-balancing or not has huge implications for whether we think about free trade policy as the best possible solution, or whether we think that there's scope for activist state policy in the realm of international trade. On a very basic level, we can think of international trade, especially in this 19th century setup, as an international expansion of exchange. So if in the analysis of the nature of money, there has always been an extensive discussion of the role of exchange, of the role of payment, and so on, then this is the attempt to link the discussions on the relationship between money and exchange in the domestic or closed economy realm to the theories of international trade. Clearly, Thornton has a monetary theory of international trade. I think it's important to realize that when Thornton is talking about credit as regards the so-called barter economy, where he's saying even in the barter economy, it is not possible for commerce to happen without credit, he's really referring to what we would think of as money in the above sense. He's also emphasizing the importance of commercial confidence, which is expressed in the willingness of people to accept credit, which I think can be mapped onto the idea of the necessity of community acceptance for money to be positioned as such. I don't want to dwell on the specific mapping of the definition of money onto Thornton, but I think there can be no question that his theory is a monetary theory of international trade. In Thornton, money is ex ante non-neutral, as the Higgs quote has already indicated. Credit is necessary even in a barter economy, and it is necessary in order to overcome what I think we can think of as a problem of coincidence of purchase and sale. So this is similar to the idea of coincidence of want. However, this is not simply it's not basically not exactly the same, but it is about the time lapse that can happen between purchase and sale. And in this interim, money is absolutely crucial in Thornton's analysis. In the realm of international trade, shocks such as a bad harvest can disturb the coincidence of purchase and sale, where his assumption is that at any moment in time, everybody would in principle try to balance their purchases and sales. However, there can be shocks that unsettle that balance. And since every individual would try to balance their purchases and sales, the economy as a whole would roughly be balancing its purchases and sales. However, if such a dramatic emergency happens, this can be unsettled. And in such a situation, monetary policy has the responsibility to accommodate such shocks. So therefore, there can be temporary imbalance in international trade, which should be bridged through monetary policy. However, ex post, Thornton is thinking about money as neutral. Ultimately, in his view, beyond that interim, all exchange is barter. And absent a shock in trade relations, such as a bad harvest in one country, trade should balance not naturally, since, as he argues, no one wants to be permanently indebted abroad, which means that ultimately, in the long run, everyone who is engaged in international trade will try to buy as much as they are selling. So therefore, in the aggregate, it must balance. In such normal situations, absent a shock, expansionary monetary policy would be unbalancing trade. So the role of monetary policy is really to accommodate real shocks rather than to actively shape trade relationships. On the other hand, David Ricardo, who in The High Price of Bullion is responding to Thornton's contribution, is really trying to reject Thornton's idea that if there is a real shock, monetary policy can play a positive role, since the high price of bullion is not a result of monetary policy, but it's a result of something like a bad harvest. And therefore, the best that the state can do is to accommodate rather than to make the emergency worse. So in the high price of bullion, Ricardo, I think, has a non-monetary theory of international trade, since this sign somehow came out differently. This should be unequal. Anyways, he is denying the role of money as a general means of payment, since he is saying that gold is simply another commodity. So therefore, whether gold is flowing out or into the country is not an expression of trade, of the trade dynamic, is not driven by money being a general means of payment, but is simply being driven by whether gold is the best thing that a country can give in exchange to other goods. So he's operating with an ex ante neutrality of money. All exchange is barter, even though exchanges may be mediated by money. This is, at the end of the day, not analytically relevant. When trade is unbalanced, sorry, something is off here with my slide. Oh my God, I'm sorry, there was, sorry for that. So in the high price of bullion, money is neutral ex ante, all exchange is meant to be barter, is thought of as barter, and exporting gold is considered analytically as the same as exporting any other good. This also means that if you're exporting gold, which in most circumstances we would be thinking of a correlating with a trade deficit. However, in this framework, if you consider the export of gold as being the export of a commodity, then basically by definition, trade has to balance. Ex post money is also neutral, since if you assume ex ante neutrality and you deny the specific position of money as a general means of payment in your analysis of international trade, this means that ex post money must also be neutral, or in other words, in the long run, trade is also self-balancing if it is self-balancing even in the short run. In the principles of political economy, Ricardo, to some degree, gives in to Thornton's conjecture that there can be reasons that emerge from the real economy that would unsettle a trade balance. He now accepts that money is a general means of payment, and as such, he moves from a non-monetary to a monetary theory of international trade. He sticks with ex ante neutrality, but a much milder form of that. He now thinks of exchange, he continues to think of exchange as barter. However, he does include more systematically that exchange is mediated by money, and there arises, I think, a certain tension between the labor theory of money and the quantity theory of money, but that's just a side point. This means that when trade is unbalanced due to unequal absolute cost advantages, so reasons other than monetary disturbances, a countervailing money flow it emerges if one country is selling more to another than it is buying from that other country. This means that the country that sold less has to pay back in cash, which induces a countervailing money flow. And this countervailing money flow will increase the price level in the initial surplus country, decrease the price level in the deficit country, and therefore create the well-known dynamic of comparative demand advantage, which means that imbalance creates automatic forces towards balance. Ex post, there is nevertheless neutrality, and this transition from imbalance to balance in the short run situation also only matters insofar as to demonstrate that automatic forces towards balance will emerge. Ex post neutrality is still implied by ex ante neutrality, and trade in Ricardo always balances in the long run. Unless, however, there is government manipulation that undermines the countervailing money flow from coming forward in the way in which it would be coming forward in under conditions of free trade. This is the famous currency manipulation argument that we can still find frequently in policy discussions today. Okay, in sum, I think what I'm proposing is roughly a framework that is summarized in this table, which is to say that non-monetary theories imply ex ante and ex post neutrality. If you have a non-monetary theory of international trade is thought of as an international version of barter, which means that trade is always balanced. If you have ex ante non-neutrality, you have analytically space for temporary disturbances to the trade balance, and this temporary disturbance can emerge for non-monetary reasons. If you have ex ante neutrality, there should be no temporary disturbances to trade balance, and if there are such disturbances, this would be arising from monetary reasons. If you have ex post non-neutrality, there is space for structural long-term trade imbalances, which is analytically space for such trade imbalances, which is neither the case in Thornton nor Ricardo, but is the case, as I argue in a paper with Anwar Sheikh, for example, in the Smithian tradition of theorizing international trade. If you have ex post neutrality, there may be interim imbalances, there may be ex ante non-neutrality. However, these trade imbalances fade as shocks that emerge from the real side of the economy start to fade. Thank you very much for your attention.